I guess I should say hi to my professor. Hello, Mr. Cullen. This is Gabe, and here I am doing my interview project on activism during Vietnam. We have my pap right here. His name is Joseph. You can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Joseph Nagy. I'm Gabriel's granddad,
Yeah.
and
Um,
he's told me he wants to interview me about um, things I did during the war in Vietnam.
yeah. So let's get this kicked off. Okay. So first thing I want to ask, this isn't part of my questions, but how old were you when Vietnam was around? What was your approximate age?
Well, I probably first heard about the Vietnam War when I was in high school around 1964. So
Okay.
I would have probably been about 13 or 14.
All right. So right around my age. So you were probably that's when you start getting into politics a little bit. Okay. So when you first heard about it when you were in high school, what were your like complete initial impressions? Um,
Well, I grew up in a small town about 20 miles outside of Pittsburgh.
yeah.
Um, and my dad was a World War II veteran, um, and was a strong supporter of the war in Vietnam. And most of my teachers and virtually everyone else around me supported the war in Vietnam. So I, as a high school student, basically had a one-sided view of what the war in Vietnam was. So I supported it as well.
Yeah, so I guess you grew up and everybody around you they supported it, so you also supported it, right?
That's right.
Okay. So any like political sources, I guess your teachers, anybody else that influenced you the most?
I guess the national news on TV, and that was strongly pro the United States involvement in the war as well.
Yeah,
So I really had no other information about an alternative point of view.
yeah. So I guess you were kind of locked in with that one perception of what it was. Uh, while you supported it, did you know of anybody who was against it? Were there certain groups that were you heard about on the news or specific? I don't know, like
I certainly don't remember any
yeah,
now. I would guess that there was, some small reporting at that time of people who might be opposed to the war, uh, but I don't remember anything
I see.
now that seemed important to me at that time.
Okay, so it's pretty much everybody around you was very supportive of it. And this is more of a specific question about the time, but how did you feel about the draft, considering your dad was a veteran and you were
Well, I
around,
thought the
around that
draft was
age?
an important thing that people, had an obligation to support their country and
Yeah,
support their country when it was at war. Um, my father strongly supported that point of view, um, and I didn't hear anything else from anyone else.
yeah, I
So
see.
I was very supportive of the war in Vietnam. In
Yeah,
fact, I thought that when I was in high school that the government should fight it more aggressively and bomb the country more.
yeah, okay. So then you're getting into college, and that's when you start being separated from your parents and your major influences. Um, when you got to college, well, first, where did you go?
Well, I went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh
Yeah.
in the architecture program there.
Okay, so same place you lived, but when you first went there, what?
Well, it's a very different place from where
Oh
I
yeah,
grew up. I grew up in a small town, and it was very insular. Um, and it was a big shock to me when I went to the city,
okay,
um, because it was full of all sorts of points of view that I'd never even known existed.
yeah,
So it was quite a different place for me.
yeah. Okay. Um, so you go into college, came from a small town. First, like, I don't know, first time you ever see all these ideas. What were some of the ideas being circulated around college about Vietnam? Positive, negative?
Well, um, mostly um, negative to the war.
Okay.
There were student organizations that uh, were very active with freshman students coming in who did teach-ins and presented a very different point of view about the war than I had ever heard before.
Okay.
And they were
So,
very assertive about trying to involve as many freshmen as they could in those teach-ins in an effort to build support against the war.
all right. So when you heard those, were you surprised, or I guess you were surprised, but did you accept their new ideas, or did you, like, at first just oppose them right away because they were different?
I guess I was open to listening.
Okay.
I didn't reject them initially. Um, and I'm not sure why that was. Um, some freshman students did reject them initially and didn't go to teach-ins and didn't enter into those kind of discussions. But the broad majority of students did. And I guess it was just sort of part of the social environment of a freshman at CMU that you went to those things and they were done in a
Right.
way that was fun and interesting, and you could meet people, and those are all things I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Um, so it was more of a exciting, interesting, have fun kind of environment than it was like a serious study thing that you would do in class. Because the teach-ins were kind of held in public places, like in the student union, and all kind of people would be hanging out and listening, and eating and drinking and having fun
Yeah.
while the
So,
teach-ins were going on.
okay. Just to get an idea, how focused was the school on these Vietnamese ideas? Because was it easy to avoid them, or was it just everywhere people were talking about it?
It was impossible to avoid them.
Okay.
Everywhere people were talking about it, but not typically in class. Um, it was more in the sort of student
Yeah.
social life um, commons areas where um, there was constant activity around whether the war was a just thing and what students should be doing to either support it or not support it. Um, and it was a discussion that basically couldn't be avoided.
Okay.
People were
So,
excited about it. It was impacting,
yeah.
the men might be drafted. Um, so
Yeah.
it was that there were some serious reasons that made it an urgent issue for students.
Yeah. So how long did it take before you were kind of shoved to the end of the ideas? Like, were you immediately kind of pushed towards them, or did you stay stable for a while before shifting your perception?
I think that by my second semester of freshman year, I had become opposed to the war in Vietnam.
Okay. So it was very
And,
rapid.
and certainly by my sophomore year in school, I was actively involved in efforts to end the war.
Okay. Um, so I don't know if you remember any of these, but what were the main activist groups that you first started joining in about your sophomore year?
Well, a lot of the activities against the war were not clearly done by identified activist groups. I mean, there were people involved in the teach-ins and activities on campus that were members of activist groups, but the work they were doing was not necessarily identified with a specific group. In fact, often members of different groups would cooperate and do things together. So initially, what impacted me were the ideas that they were talking about, not necessarily, I didn't necessarily focus on activist groups.
Okay.
It was only later that I became involved in some of them.
All right.
And the ideas that they were talking about, basically, they were saying that, you know, that Vietnam had been fighting a war against colonial rule for decades. And it was basically, they were fighting a war of independence. And when they defeated the French, they had hoped to have their own country and run it like they saw fit. And the United States became involved. And that the US involvement in a country like that who was seeking self-determination was something that was unjust and immoral. And, you know, Vietnam had a right to self-determination and should be able to decide the kind of government they wanted and the kind of country they wanted themselves without the United States interfering. And to me, that made perfect sense. It was kind of like, you know, the United States fought a war of independence against Great Britain and set up the kind of government the United States wanted, and was basically saying that other countries should have that same opportunity and right. And to me, that made sense.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, they were trying to, I guess, free Vietnam from all the colonists. Were trying to decide. What were these groups actually doing? Was it like sit-ins, or were they going to the government officials, or some of the activities that they were pulling?
Oh, well, the effort against the war was a constant and ongoing thing.
Yeah.
You know, people were planning different activities all the time. There were small local demonstrations in downtown Pittsburgh. People would go talk to the Congress people. Usually in the spring and fall, there would be major demonstrations in Washington, D.C. that involved a lot of planning and effort to turn out a lot of people. And then there was just the ongoing teach-ins and educational kind of stuff where these organizations were trying to educate new students who, you know, were first starting to think about the war, but also reach out and to people in the broader community and try to convince them that the war was wrong and that the United States should disengage. So there, you know, there was constant activity at all different times during the year.
Okay. And it sounds like the school itself was very supportive. Nobody was trying to suppress these new ideas.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
Initially, at CMU, there wasn't activity by the administration against the teach-ins. At other universities, there was. But the university wasn't very supportive of faculty members being involved. And there were some. And some of them were very vocal publicly about their non-support of the United States' involvement in the war. And over a 3 to 4 year period, those faculty members who were most public were either fired or their contracts weren't renewed. So I certainly wouldn't say that CMU was supportive
Okay.
of the efforts of students and faculty to end the United States involvement in the war.
All right. So I guess they fired teachers, made sure they didn't speak up too much. Okay. Next. So sorry, my mom was just calling me. Who are the kinds of people that were actually like enthusiastic about the war? Like past veterans such as your dad or
Well, yeah, I mean, my dad was involved in World War II and felt very strongly that people should join the military and support our country. And he was also very concerned about what he saw as a communist threat, and believed that if Vietnam became a communist country, that other countries surrounding it would become communist countries, and that the next thing that would happen is that the communists would try to take over the United States. And he had lived through the McCarthy era in the 1950s, where there was a systematic attack by members of Congress on anyone who was leftist or communist in this country. And he believed that that attack was justified and that there was a real communist threat. And in the same way, a number of my teachers in high school who were, former Marines and very proud of their military service to the country, they taught us the same thing. And at that time, many people believed that. It wasn't, to say that what was called the domino theory, where those countries in Southeast Asia would become communist and then the United States would be under threat, was something that most people believed was true and that it would happen. And when people started saying that wasn't the case, it was not something that was accepted. It was something that was viewed as almost being treasonous.
yeah. I guess America or the veteran people who supported the war wanted to just rid the world of communism, because so it wouldn't threaten America's government, I guess. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they saw the alternative economic system of communism and socialism as a threat to our economic system.
Yeah. Okay.
That it was a war between two views of how countries ought to be organized.
Okay. So when America flew in, what were they trying to achieve? Were they just trying to keep Vietnam down so they couldn't establish a government, or what were they doing in Vietnam?
Well, Vietnam at that time was separated into two separate countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese were a communist country, and the South Vietnamese had a government that was supported by the United States and was opposed to Vietnam becoming a socialist or communist country.
Yeah.
And so the United States' involvement was to maintain that government in South Vietnam and prevent Vietnam from becoming a unified single country that had a more socialist or communist form of government.
Yeah, okay. Um, so were there any like major events throughout your experience in college where you like fighting against the war that really put a ripple in the water that changed your mind or swayed your opinion? Anything that stood out?
Well, I don't remember specific events that changed my mind. Um, like I said, by my second semester freshman year, I was already opposed to the war, and I became um, actively involved in efforts to oppose the war by my sophomore year. So in terms of changing my mind, I don't remember specific events. I just remember that the arguments against the war made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. So you sophomore year you start actually participating in these events. Um, what was the dynamic like between you and the groups? Were you
Yeah. So I guess the the most important thing for me, I think, was, and I think for many of the younger people involved, was that we experienced something that we called a movement. Um, and to us, that was like a feeling that you were involved with a very large group of people who were trying to do something that was important.
yeah.
And it was more than just being involved in an organization. It was a feeling that that this large group of people was going to do things that impacted the direction of the country related to the war, and that we were committed to stopping the war, and that it wasn't just me as a person or me being involved in an organization. It was that there were hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of people involved in wanting to stop the war. Um, so I had never felt anything that compelling before.
Yeah. You're very involved in the group and you
See, it's more than a group.
well the whole effort together of trying
Yeah,
to
it was like this large community of people who were committed to doing something together that they felt was very important and right to do.
yeah. Okay.
I mean,
So
the other kind of movement that was happening at the same time was the civil rights movement.
yeah.
And many of the people involved in the anti-war movement were also involved in the civil rights movement in one way or the other. Um, so um, the goals of the people involved in this movement that we were involved in were broader than just stopping the war. We also wanted to build a better country here that was more fair and just.
So you were part of this big collaboration, this big movement. But you as a person, you at your school and Carnegie Mellon, what were you guys actually doing to help stop the war?
Well, we did things in Pittsburgh that were similar to things going on all around the country. Um, we talked earlier about the kind of ongoing anti-war activity that was happening at different times during the year. But the movement was involved in uh, both political and kind of cultural things. So here in Pittsburgh, we set up a series of things that were focused on young people in the city. So we set up a co-op that sold food and all sorts of other kind of useful everyday items that people needed. We set up a free clinic that provided health care, contraceptive care, abortion counseling. Those kind of things weren't readily available back at that time.
Yeah.
We set up an underground newspaper called the Pittsburgh Fair Witness that we put out monthly. And one of the main things the Fair Witness did was provide information about the war in Vietnam, because the news that you heard on the TV didn't accurately describe what the on-the-ground conditions were like in Vietnam for both Vietnamese people who were living in villages and farming rice and rice paddies, or the soldiers who were there fighting. It wasn't until late in the Vietnam War that the national news started to actually cover those kind of things. So the underground newspapers were an important source of accurate information about the war in Vietnam. And myself and my friends worked on the underground newspaper, writing and distributing it. We also had something called the Pittsburgh Switchboard, which was a call-in place for mostly young people who needed information or needed help related to things. Housing or information about, where they could get certain kinds of medical care, or where they could buy things that they couldn't find in a regular store. So this movement was involved in fighting the war and supporting the civil rights movement, and also a whole series of cultural things for younger people. We were part of the youth culture. We went to Woodstock. We liked rock and roll. That sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So being involved in the youth culture and being involved in the anti-war activities kind of like went hand in hand. It was like the right hand and the left hand. It was hard to separate them. And that's why it felt like a movement to us, because it was kind of the way we lived our everyday life. It wasn't just sort of like being a member of an organization. It was like wanting to live a different way of life than our parents lived.
Yeah, it was a whole culture.
It was a culture, and to us, that was important in establishing who we were and what our values were and what we believed in and what we wanted to become. And that was really the purpose of going to college in the first place, to figure out who we wanted to be. And that's what we were doing.
So you guys were, it sounds like you were mostly focusing on young people, just like yourselves, trying to build a new way of thinking. Were you guys, was it effective? Did you guys see growth in your?
Well, certainly the broad majority of young people at that time were involved in these kind of things.
Okay.
And at the same time, we were trying to reach out to people like our parents and middle-aged and older people, and frequently not that successfully. But over time, slowly, um, the opinion that the war was not just and should end uh, slowly began to take hold in many other segments of the country, not just younger people. Initially, there was just strong and unified support among both the Democratic and Republican Party to fight the war. And as time went on, there were actually candidates within the Democratic Party that took the position as the war should end. They were never elected president, but there were people elected to other offices who wanted to end the war. So slowly over time, what started off for us as like a focus on our own generation and younger people and a new kind of culture was able to grow and influence and impact broader parts of the country.
Yeah, so the idea grew and then it started taking hold with the public officials who supported it. Okay, so
But let me just add. But as that happened, the people that supported the war became more adamant and forceful in seeing us as a threat.
yeah,
So the police became more violent in demonstrations. The FBI and other police organizations try to identify the leadership of the anti-war movement and active people locally, and harassed and targeted them. Our underground newspaper had tear gas canisters shot through the window while we were working one night to put the paper out. No one was ever able to identify who shot the tear gas in, but we always believed, since the police had the tear gas and we didn't, it was one of them.
yeah.
So as the anti-war movement grew and reached out and gained support in broader segments of the country, the backlash from the people that supported the war became more intense.
Yeah, so
And that's when some of the faculty at CMU started to get fired and their contracts not renewed.
yeah, so did it like a lot of political things, it sounds like it got dangerous pretty fast as soon as the ideas started taking hold. Did this actually affect morale with the groups and the
Well, it actually, I think, it made us more angry and more committed rather than dissuade us.
Yeah.
I would say that we became basically more outraged. And as we saw the support growing to end the war and the efforts of the government continuing to expand the war, we became more committed and more aggressive in the kind of demonstrations and activities we were organizing and involved in. So at one point we planned a May Day action in Washington, D.C., where we tried unsuccessfully to shut down the government, and different cities were responsible for organizing different groups of people that had responsibility for shutting down different bridges and intersections in Washington, D.C. And everybody went up there that day with organized affinity groups of people between 10 and 15 in number. And we tried to shut down the city. And when the police would come, we would run away from them and then go back and, try to sit down in the streets and shut down the bridges. And it was a very active, confrontational kind of demonstration. Not just a peace march where people marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. and then sat down in a big grassy area and heard speeches. We felt very strongly that if the government was going to respond to our increased support assertively, that we needed to fight back. And that's what we did.
It sounds like it was very polarizing between these groups and the government.
It was.
Yeah.
And, the government had support in a significant segment of the population as well. I mean, my dad always was opposed to what I was doing and supported the government throughout it all. And many members of my family did. And that wasn't an easy thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the watershed events of the anti-war movement was when President Nixon decided to significantly expand the war and begin bombing Cambodia, a country adjacent to Vietnam, that he said was supporting the efforts of North Vietnam to bring troops and supplies into South Vietnam to fight. And when Nixon began bombing Cambodia, there were major demonstrations on college campuses around the country. And one of them occurred in Kent State. And I think 7 students were shot, and I think 4 were killed. And another demonstration occurred in Jackson State, which was a primarily Black university in the South. And a couple more students were killed there. And that resulted in a major strike in universities all around the country that shut down the universities for between 2 weeks and a month because students were so outraged that 1, the war was expanded, and 2, that the government was killing students who were peacefully demonstrating against the war. That we felt the only thing we could do was stop the universities, and once we did that, we engaged in demonstrations out in the local cities that we were involved in. And one of those is the demonstration that I sent you the newspaper article on, where we did a thing in downtown Pittsburgh called Guerrilla Theater, where we dressed up a group of people as Vietnamese peasants and another group of people as American soldiers with rifles. And the Vietnamese people were tied up into a long line, and the soldiers were herded them through the rush hour streets of downtown Pittsburgh, beating them with rifle butts. And we had the Vietnamese peasants had little plastic bags full of stage blood in their mouths, and when they were beaten, they'd bite down on the stage blood, and blood would like fly out of their mouths, and the people in the crowd were horrified. They would, but we were trying to give people a sense of how brutal the war was for people living in Vietnam. And then we finalized that demonstration by going to the Duquesne Club, which was the main social club for the business and political elite in Pittsburgh. And we demonstrated on the steps of the Duquesne Club and poured stage blood on the steps to graphically indicate that the
Blood is spilled.
Vietnam War was supported by the business leaders and political leaders of the city of Pittsburgh. So that was how we responded, and among the group of people that I knew, to Nixon's bombing of Cambodia.
So how did the government or the police respond to those kind of protests that are more disruptive than just peace walks? How do they try and stifle your efforts?
Well, the police arrested us on the steps of Duquesne Club. And they decided for that particular demonstration that they weren't going to do a mass arrest, that they had done mass arrests before and that had cost the city a lot of money because there would be hundreds or 1,000 people in jail that they had to deal with. So at that demonstration, they decided they were going to just arrest 2 people and fine them the maximum they could under the disorderly conduct ordinance in the city. So the police responded in different ways at different times.
Yeah.
And sometimes they responded more violently and sometimes they responded more rationally. I mean, by the time we did the Duquesne Club demonstration, they were very aware that if they responded violently like they had at Kent State and Jackson State, that it would exacerbate the situation even more. So they were on their best behavior at that time.
Yeah, they wouldn't want to cause an uproar. It would cause even more.
They wouldn't want to further exacerbate a situation that was already very bad.
Yeah. Okay. Here, what else? So, you were taking part in all of these, and okay, let's take another break. I gotta let this run through my mind. That was good, I guess.
So did I give you a
Yeah.
clear enough picture of kind of what we were doing and the
Oh yeah. No,
intensity of it?
That was good because I think he's gonna like all the blood spilling because it paints a good picture of what was actually happening, and the teacher actually he's a hippie himself a little bit, which is kind of funny. So he's gonna like the project, you know. Okay, so where do I?
So now you wanted to get maybe into the retrospective stuff, like
Well,
what's it all mean? Or do you have questions before that?
I was thinking, I don't know, we could. I feel like we don't. There's questions we could ask that aren't retrospective, but still
Well,
are
ask
more. Okay, well, I mean, I could. I'm kind of battling myself on whether to go more personal or more broad, because I know this heavily disrupted your relationship with your family. I don't want to get into that though, but I don't know. I should have thought about this. I mean, do you want to talk about that? It's a little bit heavy, and I don't know how much it actually adds.
my family.
Yeah.
Well, my father and I were estranged because of this,
Yeah.
and never really were able to bridge that gap. So it's a painful part of my life, but I don't regret the things that we did to fight the war in Vietnam. In fact, I'm proud of them. And I'm sad that my father was never able to acknowledge the importance of what I did and that my friends did. I feel to this day that he was on the wrong side of history. And I think that when people read the history of the war in Vietnam now, um, it's hard to come away believing that what the United States was doing
That's
in
correct.
Vietnam was the right thing. And my father was never able to look at that, what went on in that period, and come to any other conclusion except that he was right and I was wrong.
Yeah.
And that's a sad thing.
So despite the difference in opinion, you still believe that overall it paid off. It was worth it spending your college years.
Well, yeah, I mean, being involved in the movement that I described basically gave me a set of values and beliefs that I held for the rest of my adult life, and they served me well.
Yeah.
And I tried to bring up my kids with those values and beliefs. And I think they still hold them too. And you may as well.
Yeah.
So for me, on a personal level, that was the most important thing that came out of my involvement. From that involvement, I became who I am.
Yeah.
On the level of what we actually accomplished politically from all of that stuff. I mean, I believe the anti-war movement was an important part of ending the war in Vietnam. It made it more difficult for the United States government to conduct the war. When the anti-war support in this country grew large, I think it set the grounds for Nixon deciding to end the United States involvement. That's not something I think he would have done had there not been a significant anti-war movement. But I also think that the most important reason that the war in Vietnam ended was because the Vietnamese won the war against the military war against the United States troops. That it is very difficult to fight a guerrilla war and defeat it with traditional military means. And the United States wasn't successful in doing that. The Vietnamese won that war. And in my view, should have won the war because they were fighting for their freedom and wanted to decide their own destiny as a country. And it's good that they did that.
Yeah. So you believe in total your efforts were a success, not both for your moral beliefs, but also for ending the war.
Yeah, I think it was the anti-war movement was important in ending the war. I think it also ended the draft.
Oh yeah.
And to this day, there's no draft, and hopefully you won't have to face a draft. Although I have been concerned for many years that there will be a point where Congress reinstitutes a draft. I hope that doesn't happen in your time. And I hope if they try to do it, that you'll fight it. Because I don't think the United States should be involved in anywhere near the number of wars that it is. And that for the most part, those wars are unjust and immoral. And making it easy to get young kids who don't know any better, like I didn't know any better when I came out of high school, making it easy for the government to draft those kids and put them into the military is not a very moral thing.
Yeah.
So I
So,
think ending the draft was an important contribution that the anti-war movement made. But I think as well, um, that whole generation of people involved in that movement developed a different kind of political perspective that was more progressive, um, that wanted a country that had civil rights, that
yeah,
treated people of color more decently and more fairly, that treated indigenous people more decently and fairly, that allowed women the same opportunity as men, that didn't discriminate against gay people and lesbians. And these are all changes that have happened um, since the anti-war movement, uh, based on values that were created among the group of people who fought that anti-war battle. Um, and and then throughout the rest of our lives tried to implement a value system that we saw as very different than the value system that we grew up with and that our parents, for the most part, um, believed in and aspired to.
yeah. So, what was the most, what do you believe is the most important thing you contributed to these? Something you're proud of, something you always remember, you know?
Now, I mean, what I contributed was my hard work and ideas.
Yeah,
There's no one thing that I'm most proud of. It was a long, hard, ongoing effort that required continuous work and continuous thinking of new ideas for how we could fight an ongoing, protracted battle to end the war. And what I'm most proud of is that I was part of that long, hard effort, along with many, many other people.
so you stuck with it, and now you're
Yep.
going down in history with it.
And then who decided to live their lives in a way that reinforced those values and
Yeah,
ideas.
kept them. All right. Is there anything that you wish you maybe had done different? It doesn't sound like it. You sound very, very
Yeah,
certain.
well, no, the thing that I wish that we could have been more successful at is countering the conservative backlash that occurred after the war was over. It started with Ronald Reagan and
Yeah,
continues in some ways all the way through to today. Um, I wish we could have been more successful in knowing how to fight that